So, hi, I'm Kate McNeely. I use the pronouns of she and they. In a second, I'm going to put up a presentation, but I just wanted to give it a visual description of myself. I am white-skinned, blonde hair, wearing a blue shirt with glasses and blue earrings in front of a green background with lots of art. All right. Can I get a thumbs up if my screen is fully sharing? Yes, great. Okay. So first, I want to say that I'm coming to you today from a place still known as Bulbancha, which is a Choctaw term meaning place of many tongues. And this place is also currently known as New Orleans, Louisiana. And Bulbancha rests on the unceded land of the Chitimacha Nation and is a place that served as a gathering and a trading area for more than 40 different diverse peoples, including the Choctaw, Homa, and Biloxi nations. And as a settler on this land, I recognize that my being here is part of a long history of colonialization, violent genocide of many generations of Indigenous people, and extraction. And land acknowledgements don't exist in the past tense or historical contexts only. And we know that colonialization is a current ongoing process, and that Indigenous peoples' relationships to the land are not a thing of the past, that they too are ongoing. And I want to recognize through that the intergenerational grief and trauma that persists for Indigenous communities, including the impact of residential schools across Turtle Island and the ongoing epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Land acknowledgements, not just as a justice practice, but as a story of grief. I think it's important to note that my ancestors stole the land, that some of my family members still live on today, and that ancestors of mine extracted labor from Black bodies through chattel slavery. And the grief of these actions exists for descendants across the story. So, grief theory of change, relational storytelling for grief doulaship. It feels always weird to do a land acknowledgement that is deep in grief and pain, and then jump over to saying the joy of being here with all of you today. But for me, that sits at the core of what grief aligned theory of change is about. It's an invitation to hold love in its entirety, which includes the grief and the pain that comes from our current and past histories. There's a lot of joy of being in here. For me, take what you need during this, take breaks if you need. Still, the grief is not an easy subject to talk about. I also love to see faces in the gallery view if you feel like turning on your camera and being there. And I'm hoping the last 10 minutes of this will have a question and answer period where we can say hello to people and actually talk face to face. Because at the center of this for me is relational and relational storytelling. A lot of this might feel right or intuitive to you, and I hope it does. My hope for this workshop, and in fact for this whole project, is not for a specific specialist community of grievers or grief experts, but to help us intertwine grief throughout all of our movement work. And it's why I talk about it as grief-aligned organizing. And I want to make clear that this workshop is what I'm hoping to offer is helpful frames and maybe some tools, but not solutions. And I'm trying really hard not to be prescriptive in this. And while there is a lot of information on grief out there, I will try to drop links in the chat where I can, and I will also have a bunch of resources to drop in at the end. But this also creates this idea of problematic expertise, and I think that's really complicated. The idea of expertise, we know, is deeply rooted in white supremacy, colonialism, and patriarchy, and rested upon one single form of knowing, of knowledge, that's been seen as what means expert. And at the same time, there are people who've spent deep amount of time with this subject and have completed fascinating research. And so I'm gonna try to hold the balance of learning from those who have come before and the work they have done, but also giving space for us to trust our own lived experience. And that being said, just so you know the direction I'm coming from, my background is about 15 years in cultural organizing in different social movements and grief work, especially around queer rights and climate justice. Before I get to the agenda, I just want to give us a moment of sort of a big breath and taking a moment to feel ourselves and just scan and feel where we're at, give ourselves a baseline. So just take a deep breath in, hold it for a couple counts, and let it out. I need one more of those. I get nervous with this stuff. Big breath. 1, 2. Okay, thank you. Okay, grief theory. Grief theory is a project that is a story-based research and graphic anthology project on grief and mourning in social justice movements. It's centered around cultural organizing. So a lot of our work has been comics and zines and art pieces, but there's also research and story sharing circles and workshops. Today I'm going to do the first half of the comic that I made with my movement artist sibling, Crystal Clarity, some basic grief literacy to orient us, and then give a bit of what the grief theory framework is, which is what it takes for good mourning and what is storytelling for grief doulaship. And then I'm going to finish out with the second half of the comic that dreams our future forward. And hopefully we'll have some discussion time. So like I said, this is a comic that I made with Crystal Clarity. We were creative wildfire artists responding to a call from Movement Generation, Climate Justice Alliance, and the New Economy Coalition for artists to respond to the idea of not returning to normal post-pandemic, and to help tell the story of how to shift to a just transition. I will give you all a copy of this as a mini zine at the end, but also feel free to jump in the chat if you want to respond to comic images as we go. Somewhere in the state of norm, the nefarious, oppressive, ruinous machine. Grief is our constant, unrecognized companion. And meanwhile, in our organizing work, we fight the grievances of the world, but often ignore the sorrows entangled inside of ourselves. Unconscious tentacles of grief injuring our companions, blocking the bonds between us. As vanguards for the next world, we take our stories to the street, but we will fall short of our potential power if we walk with unacknowledged and unprocessed grief. Okay, so now we're going to jump into the foundational assumptions that grief theory operates on. And just so you know, all these slides are basically they're my notebooks. So it's how I think, but also these ideas are interconnected and twisty subjects. So I will circle back to some of the same ideas again and again. And I'm going to try to not miss talking about the forest for the trees. I put these trees here to remind myself that. But the trees in this analogy are the specifics of grief. And I think it's super interesting, and we'll soapbox on them all day. So the first assumption is that we are relational creatures. Our physiology is set up for relational living as social beings. And at the core of human experience is relational organization and the systems that we make from that. The second assumption is we live in an impermanent world. As OG Octavia Butler said, the only lasting truth is change, which is from Parable of the Sower. And we live under systems of interlocking oppressions: white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, all of which have affected our relationships to each other and culture, including our ability to relate with each other and our grief. And the fourth assumption that we rest upon is we are all doing the best that we can, that we must actively engage in creating the world we wish to see in our day-to-day life now. And so do the interpersonal between people and the intrapersonal inside ourselves to make these desires of the change world a reality. Okay, so what is grief? Grief is a naturally occurring, embodied response to the loss of an attachment, which is meaning that it's part of the human experience. It is guaranteed. If we accept those assumptions that we are attachment relational beings and we live in an impermanent world, we will lose something or someone that we love at some point. And you can form an attachment and have grief to anything. And there's no hierarchy or correlation between what you are grieving and how you grieve, whether it's a person or an idea or a place or a dream. You can have grief from all of that. Now, we experience grief individually. In fact, we each experience grief in our own way. It's an embodied natural response that shows up in different styles, which that's an open tab. But we must process grief collectively. So grief is interpersonal between two people and intrapersonal inside your own mind. And to process grief, what I mean by this with the collectively is much like in digestion, where we need different foods, we all need different diets. We all move it through our bodies in different speeds, but we all need to digest our food to live. We all need to metabolize our grief through our body to have a healthy system of attachments. And part of that metabolization is done collectively. And so it doesn't necessarily have an end point, but there are ways to process things collectively, which are safe community, storytelling, movement, and sound. And that's another open tab. We'll return back to that in a minute. And I do want to say here that while it doesn't have an end point for grief, if you don't metabolize it, you end up with what we can consider as relationship constipation. But we'll talk more about good mourning and processing grief collectively later. So there are many, many types of grief, and a couple different types that are really important in social movement organizing and food justice organizing. The first one I want to mention is collective grief, which is grief that's felt by a group or society or community. So think Hurricane Katrina or COVID. Then there's complex or cumulative grief, which is when you have multiple griefs and different types of grieving compound on itself. And then we have what's called anticipatory grief. So loss that we see coming and we're already grieving for it. So think climate change or a life-threatening illness. Then there's what's called disenfranchised grief. And I think this one is really important. This type of grief is when someone's culture or society or community makes them feel like their loss and their grief is invalid or insignificant. So for this, think about the families of people killed by the police or the chosen families of AIDS victims during the plague in the 80s, folks who, where either their death was seen as stigmatized by society, maybe suicide or overdose or AIDS, their relationship is seen as insignificant. Sometimes mental illness falls under this. And this type of grief, when society doesn't recognize it as valid, it makes it harder for that grief to be metabolized and can even lead to the traumatization of the griever. And open tab on trauma. Other ones there that's really big is vicarious grief, which is sort of pieces of the core of grief theory work. And this idea is that our bodies experience a sense of loss to stories of grief that we hear from those we are in communion with. And so you may have heard the term before, trauma stewardship, which is the trauma equivalent of vicarious grief. It's the ideas that our bodies on a neurological level don't understand the difference between processing the grief of someone else versus our own first person experience grief. So think movement organizers who are working with their community members and hearing stories about grief, or muralists who are taking in the stories to make a community mural of hurt and pain in a community. The way that their bodies process that grief is if it was first person. And then finally, just to the sort of current state of grief and grieving in this country is that it's pathologized, which means treating someone or something as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy. And along with all the problematic pieces of that in regard to disability justice, we know that sentiments like that of problematic are deeply grounded in white supremacy and colonization. And also, it's just wrong. It's the most normal, healthy, naturally occurring response. So problematizing it is a cultural response, not a actual medical physical response. And currently is seen as a barrier to change, a barrier to relationships and productivity, which two of those are incorrect. That can be a barrier, but one is absolutely correct, which we know came up at the opening keynote this morning, the idea that grief is naturally anti-capitalistic. It is actually a barrier to productivity. It doesn't have a predictable pattern. So let's throw out those stages of grief, those that we've all heard about. It's not predictable. It is requiring rest and sitting with it and stopping, and is deeply, deeply personal, but is affected by our systems and culture. And so the current state of where grief sits is very complicated. I'm going to take a moment to jump into styles of grieving real quick. And just to words that I'm going to be using, grief is what you have as a person. Grieving is how you metabolize it. And mourning is what you do publicly. So we're talking about grieving here. This is personal, intrapersonal metabolization of grief. And there's different ways of talking about styles of grieving, and there's no wrong way to grieve, and people grieve differently. And I'm going to say it again, there's no wrong way to grieve. And most of them are in very interconnected, fluid ways. These are a couple different research styles of talking about things. I call the three different styles body forward, heart forward, and head forward. So body forward is physical grieving. You grieve through going for walks or doing things or cleaning or making to-do lists. Heart forward grieving is emotional. It's feeling, expressive, You want to sit there and look at someone in the face and talk about your grief and your pain and your stories. Head forward grieving or cognitive forward grieving is researching, thinking. You want to write. You may want to sit there and think about the, you know, complex theories behind grief. If you can probably guess which forward style grieving I am. So the current state of grief understanding is basically on that personal, that under this state of racist colonial capitalism, grief and grieving is a personal, isolated exercise to overcome, to be able to return to production. And we have a cultural weakening of grief rituals and the acceptance of it. We've, like I said, pathologized grief, seen it as something that needs to receive severe therapeutic help, and that you need to be isolated in your own time and solve it. And some of this is just dominant culture, some of it's perceptions of grief, but some other things that we should sort of understand to know about how this current state of how grief is held in society and in movements is this sort of idea of a focus on empathy when we do talk to people about grief rather than compassion. So empathy is I understand you, I feel your pain, and compassion is I will walk with you through your pain. To some degree, it's kind of the difference between an ally and an accomplice. And that creates a lack of a true safe community, which we'll return to, but we mentioned before is part of how we metabolize our grief, is telling stories in a truly safe community. And so the other piece of the current state of grief for us and social movements in particular is that we're working in our own communities that could be called frontline grieving or frontline grief, where we're holding our own interconnected griefs of ancestral trauma and grief, anticipatory grief of what the climate looks like, and then also the vicarious grief of all the people that we organize with. And so this compounds into ourselves with a current state in which we aren't given space to process our grief collectively. And so we end up in this situation where we ignore our grief. We're fearful of the challenges. We're seeing it as a burden. If we do have to deal with it, we see it as something that's in between our relationships, rather than something that actually nurtures community. That through the shared stories and shared rituals of mourning, we can actually find meaning together and reinstate our commitment to each other. So that kind of lays out the question of that grief it's inescapable, it's naturally occurring, but at its core, it's inherently relational. Grief and mourning are both based on relational attachments. It's deeply related to how we make meaning from each other, our relationships to each other, and make meaning and a sense of self in the world. And so the question of whether it will be a barrier or an actual relational organizing tool is important for things like food justice organizing, because at the root of this, we know that food justice is more about growing communities than it is just about growing specific food or specific gardens or community land projects. That if we're moving into a new political system that is relational, we need to have strong relational organizing tactics. And we need to, so for that comes from being trauma informed, body centered, and grief aligned. So as a tool, as I said, grief is relational, so it can be a path to building stronger relationships. When we show up with our grief, we don't diminish the full complexity of self. We're able to show up with full vulnerability in storytelling, full complexity of the lived experience of those stories. It's grounded in disability justice. And we know that storytelling, which is inherent in the metabolization of grief, we also know that that's a social weaving technology which connects us with each other. So grief is just love in a new form. It's the space between. Grief builds communities through those relationships, through the compassionate frame of I will walk with you, your pain and my pain are siblings, the commitments that we make to each other to be with each other through our grief is the kind of commitments and connectivity that our communities need. And those commitments need vulnerability. In fact, rituals throughout time have been shown to maintain the health of communities through these, what they call containers of mutuality, which just means a space in which my story and your story are allowed to resonate with each other. And if grief is seen as this state of yearning for connection, right? The loss of an attachment is the missing of a connection, the yearning of connection. Then mourning, the public face of grieving, is answering that yearning for connection with a connection with someone else. That's what safe community means for grieving. And through that, we can make collective meaning. We can create shared values, shared vision, and a shared future story from starting from that place of shared stories of grief. And we all know that through growing community, that's how we reclaim power, and that's how we build our movements. So the kicker of this all is that grieving, when it's held well, which is still an open tab, we're going to come back to that. So metabolized, held in safe community, it actually sustains our social movements. So we need relationships for our movements to thrive. We need relationships for relational organizing, and in order to transition into the political system that makes the future we want to see. In part because grief is there no matter what, like we have to deal with it. So if we don't walk with it, we're going to have these grief monsters that were in the comic in the beginning that comes up from grief ignored. But on the flip side of that, grief is actually a relational technology. Grieving is a relational technology. When we share our stories of grief with each other, we actually deepen and make more authentic connections to each other. And we know that stronger relationships mean an increase in serotonin and a number of other things that help fight burnout. But the other piece is that we know that the way of grieving with community, in safe community, creating a space of compassion, that actually shifts our pain receptors away from just, I feel your pain, which is empathy, into a space of solving the uncertainty and moving into action, which all of these things have been shown to decrease burnout in movements. So not only do we have strengthened relationships, do we have shared meaning making in our community, but we have strong compassion in order to shift the culture, both in our movements and outside of our movements. Okay, finish line here. So what does good grieving look like? Ultimately, at the core of this is a simple invitation to be with your grief, to move from I have to fix to I can walk with. So like I said, grieving is how you metabolize grief through your own body, and mourning is the public and relational act of grieving. So individually, we need good grief. As a movement and as communities, we need good mourning. To metabolize that grief through ourselves, we need those four things: safe community, movement, sound, and storytelling. So when I say safe community, I mean a group of people that will listen to your grief and will tell you that your grief is valid, your life is valid, your experience is valid. When I say storytelling, I mean something that holds the fullness of the loss and the person that's telling that story. And then movement and sound is pretty straightforward. I mean movement, like walking or dancing or shifting your body, and sound, singing, talking, those two things. And I'm biased here, but all of these four things to me really sound like cultural organizing. And so one of the pieces here is that cultural organizing and storytelling is a perfect on-ramp for us to incorporate good mourning into our organizing practice. So storytellers can be the vanguards of the good grief practice, creating safe community where the fullness of grief, the legitimacy of loss, both of those things are held, and where the right to grieve is allowed, and where the space for different styles of grieving is created. So this is super complicated. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, right? Like some people who are heart grievers, they want to sit here and talk about their feelings and go into the whole story of the loss. And then people who are head grievers, they want to write things and talk about what grief does to the body. And the people who are body forward grievers, they want to go for a walk and maybe start cleaning up the garden and not talk about grief in particularly at all. But one space doesn't have to be the grieving space for all. It's just important to make space for grief and grieving as we organize, as we tell our stories. And so, yes, trauma-informed practices go hand in hand with grief-aligned practices. But one of the things I'm saying is trauma-informed, not trauma porn. Good grieving doesn't just highlight the pain of the loss. It tells the story of the loss and gives space for the full, authentic identity of the griever. So in order to hold that complexity of validating the right to grieve, you lead by compassion, right? Which is that empathy plus action, not just I feel your pain, but I will walk with you while you heal. And making space for the full emotional spectrum, including grief, and incorporating movement and sound. And I think this might be a good spot for me to close my open tab about trauma. I do think it's important to highlight that grief and trauma are different. Grief can become trauma. It can be traumatizing, and trauma can cause grief. I particularly like Gabor Mate's understanding of trauma, which is returning to the idea of wound, and that trauma is what happens inside of you mentally, emotionally, and somatically, right? So relating to the body. It's not the external event, but the inability to integrate that event with your psychological self. So we live in a traumatic world in an oppressive society, but not all traumatic moments will cause trauma. That trauma is what happens inside of you as a result to what happened to you. And grief is a reaction to a loss of an attachment. So you can experience a traumatic moment and be traumatized and have grief all at once, but none of them are required at the same time. Okay, so storytelling, bottom line, don't turn away from grief. If you're talking about organizing around really anything, giving space for the interdependence, right? Responding to that yearning for connection and giving space for connection, having a full spread of emotions, allowing grief and joy and love and excitement to all sit there on equal value. Most importantly, asking what people need. People will tell you how they want to talk about their grief. And when they get a chance, they almost always are incredibly grateful for it. And one of the things that I think is a really interesting space for information on this is Esther Armah's work on emotional justice as a frame, restorative emotional justice. And I'll put a link to their website at the end of this. And so one sort of example about this, let's say for food justice, is if you're talking about organizing around a community garden and you're making open-ended space for relational organizing to get folks involved, what grief-aligned organizing says is give space for people to talk about how they feel, what they've lost, what they're grieving about, before moving into what's next, what are we building, what are we doing. Some people will grieve by moving into that what are we doing space, but not everyone. And so it's, you know, how did it feel to have a vacant lot next to your house, to lack fresh food? You know, just it's not moving immediately into the what we are doing, but the why we are doing that as an organizing strategy to give stronger, deeper relationships that will sustain the work that we're doing. So by centering the interdependence of our collective grief and the connections we find in it, and giving space for people to find those connections on our own makes for stronger organizing. And so what does it look like when we give space for grief-aligned storytelling? So we're going to jump back to the end of the comic, which our grief as a creative companion strengthens our soulful strategy. Our grief as a connector shows us how to sow and care for relationships. Our grief as a messenger of our stories resonates. And our grief honored makes space for the kinship we need to flourish. So that brings me to the end of my presentation slides. I'm just going to put up here sort of one of our slides from our bigger zine. The idea that transition is inevitable, but without honoring grief, justice is not. That by actively metabolizing our grief in community, we can shift our collective creativity away from individualism towards cooperation and collective care. Thank you. So there's a QR code up there for grief theory where there's a mini zine, but I'm actually gonna drop, we've got a slido.com. I've got 2 questions coming up that we can answer as a group before we get into a question and answer period. There's also, I wanted to give you all, and here, I'll just pop these in here. I wanted to give you my personal email, the Grief Theory website, and our Instagram where we put our new comics. And then we have a zine packet. We made a mini zine of the comic, and this one is specifically for the food justice event. In fact, there's a raffle code hidden in this one. And if you go to where you logged into this through the back end of the system, you can find this again, but, and if you're not in the Zoom right now, you're watching the recording, you can log into the food justice through the main agenda. But for everyone in the Zoom in the chat, there's a direct drive link for the printable zine. And then here are some of my links from resources. Okay. So first I want to pull up is, what style of grieving do you identify with the most? If you pulled up Slido, will you put it in there? And if you didn't, you can pop it in the chat and we'll just pretend that they're all one big. All right, we got 2 people split for emotional and cognitive. You can also pop it in the chat if you want, and I'll say it out loud. Oh, we've got an even split. I feel like I'm watching like a race of turtles or something. But it was way more exciting for me than it should have been right then. Well, we got a physical in the chat, got another physical online. Wow, we've got a lot of physical grieving, which is like, people don't recognize physical grieving as grieving, right? Like they're like, oh, they're just cleaning their garage. They're not actually dealing with their grief, when really that's somehow some folks fully grieve. Got a more than one is leading the most here. And which, so this is really interesting to me because heart forward grieving or emotional grieving, or you know, it has other titles, intuitive grieving, is what people think of when they think of grieving, someone sitting around and able to tell the story of their grief, when really how grief moves through people's bodies is very personal and very different. All right, so we've got a lot of physical grievers and more than one in this room. I'm going to bring us to the next slide. Got one more question. What are you grieving right now? What grief feels particularly heavy today? And I know you guys have listened to a lot of different things. There's a, you know, the world is a tough place. What are you walking with? Ooh, loss of time. Yeah, I feel that. Oof. I definitely feel loss of time. unhealthy work environments. I am with you on that. I feel grief for that as well. And if you're not on Slido, feel free to put it in the chat if you want to join in here, and I'll verbalize it out to the room. Loss of loved ones. I feel you with that. Yes, loss of loved ones. That's a lot of grief that you walk with. The changing climate, anticipatory grief, also known as prefigurative grief of that, but just it's very real, and it feels just as complex as any other losses. Being limited in justice work by a work environment. Oof. I feel that the loss of possibility in your justice work. Yes. Lack of rest, proper rest, fleeting youth. Oof. Yes, I share these griefs. I'm going to let a couple more be put out into the room and hold these griefs together. The earthquake in Turkey and lives lost and greed, construction court. Yes, that was one of the ones that was really feeling really strong for me today. That what happened in Turkey and Syria. Okay, I am going to stop sharing my screen and come back to the room and put us in gallery view. If you wish to join, this is a great moment to come in, say hello. If you have any questions and you want to raise your hand for that, that's great. If you want to put it in the chat, I will read it out loud. I'm cool with that as well. Are there any questions? Hello. Thank you for showing me your faces, folks that are there. It is beautiful to see you. Hello. I know I went through a lot very fast, but I'm happy to jump in with anything. One of the links that I gave is this really phenomenal person, Rachel Ben-Soussan, who I consider a mentor, who does really great workshops and trainings for organizations on grief literacy through a anti-racist lens that I highly, highly recommend. Can I speak on the differences in processing grief versus processing trauma? Yeah. So first of all, there's processing grief personally and processing grief publicly or mourning. And because grief is a relational, it's a personal response to an attachment, right? So it's a relational embodied emotion. It needs that relational processing. You do some intra processing in your side yourself, but you also need that mourning practice. So the community, the storytelling. And that's one of the things that's very particular to grief. Grief has a external relational processing piece to it. The processing trauma, I don't work with trauma. I'm not a trauma expert. And I would even hesitate to say I'm not a grief expert, even though I've been working with it for a very long time. But that trauma is, there's various different theories of how to process trauma, but that is a personal process, maybe with like a therapist and things like that. But it doesn't have that communal relational space to it. And it's not specifically related to loss of an attachment. So that yearning of connection and that relational piece from that, the yearning doesn't show up. How does one become more comfortable with sharing their grief with folks when normally they're not heard? Whew. One, I feel you on that. That is really hard. It's why I underline in these presentations disenfranchised grief, that it's not just like, oh, your grief wasn't heard. That's an actual, like, it makes it worse. It is a type of grief when you are not heard in your grief and your grieving. And I think that what I would say in that is that it's not, first and foremost, it's not you becoming more comfortable. It's finding safe community where your grief is seen as valid and heard, and building community in your organizing that values that understands people's grief needs to be seen and made valid as it is and not questioned. That being said, sharing your grief when you're not sure you're going to be heard, I think we're all probably thinking of like the internet, right? Like on social media. I think it's finding what in the sharing of the grief is the value for you. What style of grieving are you looking to get in that? Like if you are an emotional griever and it's important for you to be heard and responded to, don't share your grief on Instagram unless you know your community there will respond back to you and give it the validity that it needs. Find those individuals that you can grieve one-on-one with. If you're a physical griever, but you want to do it in finding people who like to go for walks and maybe not talk about things, but you're doing the grieving internally while you're moving through space. I hope that answered the question. So sorry. What should folks do when someone isn't willing or ready to hold your grief with you? How do you hold compassion for yourself and that person at the same time? Oof. Yeah. So there's a link that I shared before that is from, and my mind now has been spiraling for an hour, so I'm not going to remember exactly the name of this institute, that is about compassionate meditation and it's studying neuroscience and Buddhism, and how just 5 minutes of a compassionate meditation a day rewires the neural pathways in your brain. Like they put people in an MRI for this, that helps train yourself for more compassionate space in all things. Like I like to think about the brain pathways as like an overgrown garden with some walkways have been paved, right? Like the things society has taught us, the baggage we have, for good or for worse, we have paved pathways in our brain. But we can take a machete and like go off and like make some new beautiful darn pathways. And one of the ways to do that they've found is through recurring short compassionate meditations help train your brain to move from empathy into compassion and have that space of compassion for yourself and for others. The other piece is, and this is not in the like super in the literature, but like if someone's not willing to hold your grief, like you don't need to organize with them. Like make the priority of working with people where you're sharing your grief, that safe community. Like we are in this middle ground where we are trying to live the future we want to see, and underneath those assumptive, oppressive systems. So as much as we can protect our own grief and grieving, we need to. But sometimes we will be in space that is not completely safe. And so it's recognizing where your own boundaries are of how much you can share without feeling disenfranchised and not seen. And part of the question of making compassion and holding compassion for yourself, which goes into that other question. So how can we better show up for someone who's grieving? I think the number one thing is ask people how they would like to have you show up. I don't think a lot of people have had someone say, hey, do you like to grieve by going for a walk? Or would you rather like tell me a story? Or do you want to cuddle with that adorable cat that's over there? Or, oh, the cat heard me. It just looked at me. And or are you gonna like, do you want to read some articles about like styles of grieving and like process that? I think number one, asking someone how they want to grieve, and if they don't know, being like, well, what do you think about this and this? Like, does that feel good to you? And then following a lot of the frameworks of vulnerability and compassionate vulnerability. I will join you where you are. I will hear what you are saying. I will not question the existence of your lived experience or the validity of your grief. And I will come to that story of pain, and I'm going to be with you while you're in it. I'm not going to try to fix it. Sometimes though, a physical griever, they want to do a to-do list. So that's why you start with the, how do you want to do this, right? It's like that saying, like, do you want me to give solutions or just listen? Starting with that, it's the grief version of that. And then trying to make space where you have time to move into any of those as they arise. And I cannot underline enough of this, like, can we stop just trying to fix things and just be with things? And I think in that way, that's what I mean when I say grief is inherently anti-capitalistic, which I know was also said this morning, in that it's like not about being a productive, and it's not about moving forward with, like, you need to be with it. And if you're with it and make space to be with it, the added bonus is you actually build deeper relationships. You have stronger vulnerability, and then you have stronger communities, and then our movements kick ass. Okay, any more questions? I think we're coming up on the end here. I think I gave all my links. I love all of you for coming and showing your faces, and please be in touch with me. I'm going to read this out loud to the group for the video. I like to feel that growing community is generally the perfect space for all forms of grief. The practice of seeding, even independently, maintaining your garden, or transitioning, prepping for the seasons is so rewarding and meditative. Nature will always provide a safe and loving space. I cannot agree more. It's why there's at least one garden in our comic. That was very important for us in our showing grief walking with us. There is a survey that's going to come in. So if you don't mind doing the survey before we close out.